All right, now we're looking at section 6. And if you remember correctly from section 5, these weren't crazy problems. Um, and the reason that they weren't super difficult was because we had this 1 sitting out front. In front of our quadratic term, in front of our squared term, its coefficient was 1. Now, we're looking at problems where that isn't the case. Now, example 31, I've already gone ahead and completed here, but let's read it through. We have 8x squared plus 40x plus 48. Now, the first thing you want to do when you get to one of these problems where there's a number out front is you want to hope that it breaks apart into a much easier problem. Now here, I hoped and I pulled out an 8 from all 3 pieces, and that ended up happening. I pulled out an 8, so 8 divided by 8 gave me just the x squared. 40 divided by 8 gave me the 5x, and then the 48 divided by 8 gave me the 6. And now I'm left with this. And that looks a whole lot like a problem that we did on the previous section. The 6 breaks apart to be a 2 and a 3, and then we can break this apart. The 8 stays up front, and then we have our 2, x plus 2, and our x plus 3, and that's our answer there. Okay? If that happens, that's awesome. Okay? You factored at the very beginning, you factored something out of everything, right? And then you factored our trinomial, and you got a nice answer. That's good. That's a good answer. Now, later on, thinking about example 32, there's no way to pull out a number out of here, right? You can't pull something out of all 3 of these pieces. There isn't a common factor. So we're going to have to do it a little bit differently. So I've got this example problem here, and I want us to work through it, and then maybe we can see a pattern. So right here, I take my 3x plus 2 times 4x minus 3. And again, this is just a side problem to just illustrate something for us. And I want to multiply this out, right? This is factored, but I want to multiply it out. I'll have 12x squared minus 9x, right? And this all came from this first piece. Second up, I multiply by 2, so that gives me an 8x minus 6. And this here, this came from my second piece that I multiplied out. Now, this combines together to be 12x squared minus, well, 1x, and then minus 6. So now, if we started off with 12x squared minus 1x minus 6, I want to know how to factor that down. Now, we know the answer because it's sitting there, but I want to think about how do we get there. So I'm going to read my work here on the left, and I'm going to read it backwards. So I ended with this, and then up there, I want to turn it into that. How do I turn it into that? This guy, those 2 pieces, the negative 9x and the positive 8x, they added up to be a negative 1x. Well, I'm going to want to do that over here, but I need a rule to help me figure out how to do that. And here's our rule. You're going to take your first piece and your last piece and multiply them together. 12 times negative 6. Well, 12 times negative 6, what's that going to be? That's going to be negative 72. Now, kind of like how before, we're going to look for things that multiply to be negative 72 and add up to be negative 1. And it's just going to happen to be that it's negative 9 plus 8 is negative 1, right? Negative 9 times 8 is negative 72, and adding up they give negative 1. So here, this problem here would break apart to be 12x squared minus 9x plus 8x minus 6, right? And now we're not breaking any rules here because these 2 add up to be negative 1. Now, what we're going to do here is a fancy trick. We're going to factor by grouping. We're going to look at our first 2 pieces, and we're going to look at our last 2 pieces. We're going to look at them separately. Okay? Here, let me see if I can erase that yellow. Well, apparently not. Oh, there it goes. Uh-oh. That's a plus. All right, let me highlight. There's my green part. There's my orange part. Okay. Now, my first piece, I want to factor him. So I want to think about what is the biggest number and x that I could pull out of here. I could pull out a 3x out of both of those. In the first piece, I'd be left with a 4x, and from the negative 9, I'd be left with a negative 3. Now in the second one, I'm going to pull out what could I pull out? A 2. So I can pull out plus 2 And this would be left with a 4x minus 3. Okay, again, this guy is coming from just those two. This one's coming from just those two. Now, think about what I've got there. These both in common have the 4x minus 3. So it can actually be factored out. So I'd have the 4x minus 3, and then I take my leftover terms. My leftover was 3x and 2. And that's my answer. That is what we started with, right? Yep, I wrote him backwards, but that is what we started with. So right there, that's the process that we're going to be doing. And let's look at example 32, and maybe as we do some of these, they'll click more. So our first step is to multiply the beginning and the end. So this is going to be 9 times 2. That gives me 18. And then I want that to break apart to add up to be 11. So I'm going to say, well, 9 plus 2 gives me 11, right? So my 11, and right, it's an 11x. I'm going to break him apart into be 9x and 2x. So this is going to be 9x squared plus 9x plus 2x plus 2. All right, this guy here, that's my 11x, but I just broke them apart. Now I'm going to look at them separately. I'm going to look at these first two pieces and the second two pieces, and I want to factor them. In the first two, I can pull out a 9x. And then I'm left with x plus 1, right? I'm factoring there. In the second two, I can pull out a 2, and I'm left with an x plus 1. All right, just to highlight what I'm doing, I've got this guy here. He breaks apart to be this guy. I've got this guy here, and he breaks apart to be this guy. Now, both of them in common have an x plus 1, so that can come out front. And I'm left with 9x plus 2. And that's that. That's our answer. Let's look at 33. I take the first and the last. 5 times 3. That is 15. Now I want two numbers that multiply to be a positive 15 and then add up to be a negative 16. Well, that's going to be negative 15 and negative 1. So I'm going to break this guy apart into say, well, 5x squared minus 15x minus 1x plus 3. Now I look at them separately. I look at the beginning two, and I look at the ending two, and I think about what can I pull out. In the first ones, I can pull out a 5x. That leaves me with an x minus 3. In the second one, I can't pull anything out at all. So I'm just going to say, well, let's pull out a 1, right? You can multiply 1 by anything. So I'm going to say plus 1 times negative x plus 3. Well, that's not going to work out because we've got an x minus 3 and then a negative x plus 3. We see that those signs are swapped. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take out a negative out of this guy here. So I'm going to write down the first as 5x and then x minus 3. And then if I change this to a negative 1, then it'll be x minus 3 in the parentheses. All right, so I kind of remove that negative. Now this will work out. I've got a repeated x minus 3, so that can come out front. And then I have 5x minus 1 left over. And there we are. Scrolling down to 34. I'm going to start off with 3 times 5. That gives me 15. Oop, and it's a negative 5, isn't it? So it's a negative 15. So I want two things that multiply to be negative 15 that add up to be positive 14. I'm thinking 15 minus 1, right? 15 times negative 1 gives me negative 15. And whenever I subtract that, that gives me a 14. So this will break apart to be 3x squared plus 15x minus 1x minus 5. Now, like before, I look at my first two guys together, and then I look at my second two together. In the first ones, I can pull out a 3, right? There's a 3 and a 15. I can pull out a 3. And then both of them have an x, so I can pull out an x. Left over, in the first term, I remove the 3, so I'm left with just an x. In the second term, I remove the 3, so I got a 5, and then I also remove the x, so it's just x plus 5. Now, thinking about our last problem. In our last problem, that blue highlighted piece there, the piece in parentheses, we want them to be the same. So looking at here, we've got an x plus 5, positive x and positive 5 in parentheses. In the second one, they're a negative x and a negative 5. So I'm going to pull out a negative 1, and that leaves me with x plus 5 there. Now I can factor out, I pull out my x plus 5s, and then I'm left with 3x minus 1. Now, just to show what's happening here, this 3x, what if this was 3x times y minus 1 times y? I think that's a little bit more obvious if we think about that. And the y can come out front. This is y and then 3x minus 1, right? That's the process that's occurring here. Sometimes I think that's hard to visualize and see what's happening there. But we're just pulling something out, right? The y is representing the x plus 5 there, right? It's being pulled out front, and then our leftover pieces here are the 3x and the minus 1. Okay, that's the process that's occurring. All right, example 35 here. Now, one thing to note, or to notice, is that we have a negative hanging out front. We've got that negative. Now, for me, whenever I do these problems, I don't like dealing with the negative. And in fact, you shouldn't deal with the negative there. We're going to pull out a negative right away, right? Kind of like how in example 31, we removed the 8 out of everywhere, right? We factored the 8 out. So here we're going to factor out a negative 1. So I'm going to pull out negative 1, negative 1. That's going to leave me with a positive 4x squared, then a minus 8x, and then a plus 3. Right, think about that. If we distributed back in that negative 1, we'd get back to what we started with. Now we approach the problem in the same way we've been doing. We take 4 times 3, that gives us 12. We want two numbers that multiply to be positive 12, that add up to be negative 8. That's going to be negative 6 and negative 2, right? That adds up to be negative 8. So this is the negative 1 still hanging out front. Then we'll have 4x squared minus 6x minus 2x plus 3. Right, these guys add up to be the negative 8x. And then we're going to have our negative 1, and I'm going to actually change these parentheses to brackets just so that it's easier to see what's happening here. And now my first set, I can pull out a 2x, and then I'm left with what? 2x minus 3. And then I look at my second piece. Well, I've already got a negative 2x plus 3, so I'm going to pull out a negative 1. And then I've got 2x minus 3. Next up, I have my negative 1 still sitting out front. And then I'm going to pull out the 2x minus 3. And I'm left with 2x minus 1. Now, just to write this a little bit prettier, I'm going to say, well, I've got negative 1 times 2x minus 3 times 2x minus 1. And that's the way that I would write my answer. Okay, I use the brackets in the middle there just to make it a little bit more clear of what's happening. But I like the answers to just have parentheses there. All right, that is that problem. Something to note is that negative right in the beginning, he hung around. He's still in the very front, but we don't place it with anything. We just have it separate there, okay? Some people would sometimes move that back in and multiply them back in. I would not. I would just leave it there. I think it's better if it's there. That's the way that I would leave my answers there. All right, that is section, what is this? Section 6. All right, is it just one more to go? I think so. All right, that's that.